All right, hello everybody. It is I, graduate historian, continuing our AP government series. We have come to Unit 4, elections. This is where the rubber meets the road, or where the dollars get spent, depending on your point of view. All right, this is really simple. We have one chart for this particular video, so we're going to get right to it. The way America does elections is we basically have a nomination period or nomination process that runs a very long period, and we have elections, right? So if you look in some of the study guides, and again, by the way, editorial comment, highly recommend getting a study guide. I use the one by Princeton Review. Get the study guide, do the practice tests, okay? Study guide may or may not, help you with your knowledge depending on how much you paid in class, but trust me, taking those 5 practice exams will be well worth your money. Now, let's talk about nominations and elections. Okay, so we start with a primary system, right? And for anybody who's been paying attention this year, because it's presidential election year, you get to see the American election process in all its glory or infamy, depending on your point of view. But we have a series of primaries and caucuses, okay? And, we have the Iowa caucus, okay, which is always the first one, which is really sort of a glorified party, right? Democratic party, and Republican party. But then you have primaries, which are basically elections that the parties run to select candidates within the party, right? This is where the parties have a chance to develop new candidates, show off candidates. It's sort of a, dare I say, a difference between a tryout and a beauty contest, right? So the primary season, particularly for presidential politics, is insufferably long. Let's just call it what it is. It is insufferably long. Typically, state level, congressional and senatorial primaries, they're, set usually in the summer before an election to give the parties time to kind of do their thing. And like I said, the two things that they talk about here in the book is a closed primary and an open primary, right? And why is this important? Well, in a closed primary, when you register to vote, you select a party affiliation. So in that situation, if you're a Republican, you vote in the Republican primary. If you're a Democrat, you vote in the Democratic primary. If you're an independent, you don't really vote in a primary. Or if your state has an open primary, which means that you can vote for whoever you want. So a lot of people say, well, that's a dirty trick, because if you're Republicans, you could vote for the crazy Democrat, or if you're Democrats, you could vote for the crazy Republican. Understand it all. That's just the rules. Most states that I have lived in have had closed primaries, okay? So you have to vote for the party that you're registered to. And the way they do that, of course, is they print 2 separate ballots. So you go in, when you show your ID, if you show your ID, which hopefully you do, they give you a ballot for whatever respective party you belong to, right? Now, this is very interesting because we didn't used to have primaries and caucuses because, hey, by the way, that would have taken like years by horse or even railroad. So we had these things called party conventions. Now, this year we had a really like that party conventions by Zoom. Trust me, when you see a real party convention like at a convention center with thousands of people, yeah, it's a party, but it's like crazy, right? And you see all kinds of things. Conventions are combination like circus, beauty contest, pep rally, fundraising, because there's always money involved, right? But interestingly, in the old days, party conventions were where candidates, there was wheeling and dealing, there was backroom dealing, deals were made, deals were broken. That was how candidates got selected. If you've ever read the really fascinating book, Team of Rivals, by Doris Kearns Goodwin, which I highly recommend, it is a story of how Abraham Lincoln was elected president and how he chose his cabinet, because several of the people in his cabinet had run against him for the nomination. William Seward, Salmon Chase, both of them thought Lincoln was like this country bumpkin, unsophisticated, not all that bright. And they, of course, like good politicians and many cabinet secretaries, assumed that they would be a much better president. But if you look at the party politics and the wheeling and dealing and how that convention worked, I think it was the 3rd ballot by the time they got Lincoln elected. Nowadays, of course, the conventions, there's really not a lot of drama. There may be some drama over who gets picked for the vice presidential slot. There's sometimes a lot of drama about the party platform. But by the time you get to the convention, through the primary and caucus process, you've pretty much got your candidate, right? It's kind of anticlimactic in that sense. The last true sort of crazy, what the heck's going to happen political convention was probably, I don't really know, because all the elections that I've watched, there's not been a lot of drama to them. I mean, a lot of showmanship and a lot of, that, but not a lot of drama of, wow, who are they going to select? What's going to happen? Now, rewinding a little bit, yes, it's a long and winding road to office, particularly they talk about it a little bit in the book. But if you look historically, people that want to run for the presidency work on that for years. And I'm not talking like, nowadays where like the day after the presidential election, the media, always coming back to my friends, the media are like, what's going to happen at the next presidential election? No. But if you go back and look at one of my favorite presidents, Ronald Wilson Reagan, 40th president of the United States, Reagan spent from essentially 1964 to 1980 getting to the White House. Now, he had a couple of terms as governor of California back then. Bet you people wish you had Reagan in office now, just saying. But if you look at his, how he developed his political philosophy, by the way, Reagan, really, really smart guy. Don't believe all the garbage that's peddled by the left that Reagan was some dunce. Reagan was very, very well-read, very, very organized in his thoughts. There's a couple of really excellent books. You got Reagan's Diary and you got Ronald Reagan by His Own Hand, I think is the title of the other one. You can see Reagan's philosophy in his own correspondence build over the years, okay? But what you do to get to the Oval Office in particular, you have to spend a lot of time and money, right? And you spend a lot of time on what's called the rubber chicken circuit. Now, for any of you that have ever heard that phrase, this is when you go to lots and lots of like Kiwanis meetings, conventions, political, you go to the Wetumpka, Iowa Republican Convention and you make a speech. Why do you do this? Well, you're building up your base, so to speak. You're getting your face out there. You're getting people used to you. And you're starting to look for not only what do the people want, right? Going back to that lesson we had on public opinion, but you're also finding out who are your allies, who can you rely on to help you in that particular state, right? Who's the up-and-comers in your party in the state of Iowa, right? So who do you have to pay attention to? And maybe you do something for them, right? Politics is a very relational activity, right? So it's like, I got a guy who's got a guy who can do something for me. Oh, so I got to do this guy a favor because he did me a favor. You know what I'm saying? And of course, the primary season this year was not quite as dramatic as 2016. Is pretty dramatic, but it all leads up to Super Tuesday, right? The way the primaries are constructed are, we have a number of primaries to give the candidates a chance to get out, meet the people, show themselves, et cetera, et cetera. But then you lead up to Super Tuesday where you have like 10 or 15 states have their primaries that day. The idea is to get rid of the riffraff and the wannabes and get down to maybe one or two candidates that have a realistic shot at securing the required number of delegates for the nomination. Now, they don't talk about that in the book here, but if you look at it, the way the Republicans and Democrats did their presidential primary and have done their presidential primary in the past is very, very, very different. And you can kind of see how a way outsider like Donald Trump would end up with the Republican candidate, a Republican nomination as the Republican candidate, whereas in 2016, Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders were duking it out almost all the way up to the convention. Well, because the Republicans set up their primary with a series of winner-take-all states, right? So if you win the most Republican votes in a particular state, you get all that state's delegates, and that's kind of divvied up by the parties how they allocate delegates, because there's like something like 3,000 Democratic delegates and like 2,500 Republican delegates, something like that. I don't remember the exact numbers. But the Republicans have most of their early primaries set up as a winner-take-all scheme. That helps a particular candidate build momentum going into Super Tuesday. The Democrats would have proportional representation. So if a state, let's say, has 100 delegates, so candidate A gets 40% of the vote, they get 40 delegates. Candidate B might get 38% of the vote, so they get 38 delegates, right? And then everybody else, parcels up the crumbs remaining. But you could kind of see as you go through a primary that if number one and number two are staying fairly close, that candidate number two is not going to give up, because all they need is one good day and they could get enough delegates to take over the race again, right? So, and of course, the Democratic Party up until the last convention, I'm not sure what they did in 2020 because it was all virtual, so it was kind of odd. But the Democratic Party used to have what are called superdelegates as well, right? This is a huge bone of contention in 2016 because these superdelegates that are like party elders and big donors, other people, have votes the same way that the state delegates do. So however they did the math, the superdelegates were a significant block of votes that could have swung the nomination either way for Hillary or Bernie in 2016. And most of those, of course, went to Hillary. And it did not sit well with all the Bernie voters because they had been sort of neck and neck all the way through the proportional primaries, not happy that the party just sort of threw all its weight behind Hillary. We'll see how long that particular rule lasts in the Democratic Party. I can't honestly remember what they did this year because by the time they got to the convention for both parties, they didn't want any outward dissension. They wanted party unity. That's the big thing about the convention is we're done scrapping and feuding and fighting in the family. Now we all got to come together and get rid of those other guys. So that's another thing that a party convention does is it helps, in theory, supposed to help, particularly if you have a very contentious primary season like the Democrats did in 2016, and even the Republicans did in 2016. It's supposed to bring the party back together and unite everyone behind your chosen candidate, right? That's why people say that the conventions really kicks off the presidential election in a presidential election year, because at that point, all the primaries are over, all the fussing and fighting's over, and now we get to duke it out between, the Republicans and the Democrats. Then we get to the general election, right? So this year in particular, a little bit in 2016, but in particular this year, the two biggest issues are, of course, the Electoral College and voting by mail. Now, let's talk about the Electoral College first. Number one, the Electoral College is baked into the Constitution. Now, why does it exist? What's the point? Well, the Electoral College was intended to ensure that we did not have elections by popular vote. Let me repeat that. The Electoral College was intended to ensure that we did not have elections by popular vote. Now, people would say, well, that's not fair. The candidate that gets the most votes should win the presidency. Well, but think about it, though, right? This is my philosophy. The Electoral College is intended to ensure that a president has to at least pay some attention to multiple states. Now, think about this. If you had an election, presidential election, done merely by the popular vote, the president would go to New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Philadelphia, San Francisco. Seeing my point here? All the president would have to do is campaign in the big cities, because guess what? That's where the people are, right? You look at the big states. The president would go to California, New York, Florida, maybe Texas, and that's it. You would never see a presidential candidate in Kansas, Iowa, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. They just wouldn't care, because all they got to do is win the popular vote. If you ever look at, take this as an intellectual exercise, because it's in your book, it's in this study guide, but you can find it online. Look at the electoral map by county of the 2016 election, right? And even a little bit the 2012 election, but the 2016 election is fascinating. Hillary won the popular vote by about 2 million votes, right? But if you look at how many counties and congressional districts that voted for Trump versus Hillary, you have like these little pockets of blue, right? Blue Democrat, red Republican. That came about in like the 2000 election. You have these little islands of blue in a sea of red. Well, what does that mean? Well, that means that Hillary won the city and urban dwellers, for the most part. Little generalizing here. But Trump won all of the more of the suburbs and the rural. Now, people will say, well, yeah, but the Electoral College means that the election always comes down to a certain number of battleground states. Well, that's very true. And why is that? Well, because over time, what you see is certain states always trend to vote for a certain candidate, right? For example, the left coast, Washington, Oregon, and California, have not voted for Republicans since Ronald Reagan in 1984. Think about that. Have not voted for a Republican candidate since 1984. Conversely, Texas has not voted for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1976, when Jimmy Carter ran as a Southern Democrat. Okay? So you have these certain states that are entrenched, generally speaking. Everybody's always like, well, that state's a toss-up state. Well, that state could be a battleground state. Well, maybe. Politics shift. But for the most part, the coasts, right? Oregon, California, Washington, Oregon, California, New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Maryland, Virginia, all tend to vote Democratic. And that's not really going to change. It's the middle of the country where you have what's known as the elusive swing voters, right? So you have states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio. Ohio is always the bellwether, sort of the bellwether state in the country, right? Because it's like smack dab in the middle of America. So that's what the Electoral College is supposed to do. It's supposed to balance the interests of the smaller, less populated states with the larger populated states. Now, people will say, well, that's not fair. There's more people in those states. They should have more influence. Well, they do, because they have more electoral votes, right? The number of electoral votes a state gets is a combination of the number of seats they have in the House of Representatives plus 2 senators, which is why people always complain that states like Montana and, the Plains states always get at least 3 electoral votes. Well, yes, that's intended that way. They each have at least 1 representative and 2 senators. So no matter how big or small your state is, you're always going to have at least 3 electoral votes. Now, let's talk about the other thing, which has been a huge topic of conversation this year, which is mail-in voting. Okay, here's all I'm going to say about mail-in voting. There is a difference, and I think this needs to be crystal clear, because it is not. It is totally conflated by the media. There is a difference between absentee voting and mail-in voting. What's the difference? It's whether the voter requests the ballot. Now, I voted by absentee ballot the entire time I was in the Navy. I had to request a ballot. A ballot was sent to me. I did my voting. I usually had to go, I signed it, right? I usually had to go to my department head or division officer, depending on where I was, and he would countersign it, and then I would put it in the mail, and it had to be postmarked by a certain day. So, you send in your ballot. Basically, as soon as the conventions were done, they would start sending out absentee ballots because they knew who the candidates were, right? This is different than vote by mail. Now, a lot of states, and I don't know all the myriad of regulations and what state does what. A lot of states have very liberal absentee voting laws. Again, in my day, absentee voting was basically, if you're out of the country, in the military, you were basically an invalid or homebound or in a nursing home or something, that you physically could not get to the poll. Now, some states have sort of liberalized these laws a little bit, and they have, I think it's called no excuse absentee voting, which basically says if you just want to ask for an absentee ballot, you can. Cool. You know, a lot of states have early voting. Okay, cool. You know, you can go in person early at selected polling places, so you don't have, you know, maybe you do it on a day you have off or whatever, right? This is different than vote by mail. Vote by mail means the state sends everyone a ballot, whether you ask for it or not. And of course, then you would mark your ballot in theory and sign it and whatever the state regulation is and send it in. Now, in my opinion, this is not optimum because there are issues, and there have been a lot of issues with potential voter fraud. Now, I'm not going to go into all the gory details. There's plenty of cases. You can look them up on the internet. I'm less sure about the integrity of mail-in voting than I am absentee voting. Now, some people will say, well, my state has done mail-in voting for years and it's never been a problem. Well, that's true. But let's be honest. Voting for mayor or for a bond issue in your state is a little different than voting for the president of the United States. Okay? If your state does statewide elections by mail-in voting, super cool. Great. Hopefully they get more participation, right? We're going to talk about that in a minute too. But as far as a federal election for elected representatives in the House and the Senate and the presidency, there's just too much potential for hanky-panky. That's all I'm going to say. For either party, right? There's been Republicans that have been caught up in this as well. So I'm not going to cast dispersions. I'm just saying it assumes a lot of honesty and integrity. That's all I'm going to say about that. Of course, the media influence, right? There was a huge brouhaha in 2016 that, you know, the media did or didn't call certain states for certain candidates at a certain time. So, you know, when I used to watch cable news a lot when I was, you know, doing politics, I didn't even turn it on until about 11 o'clock at night, right? Because you needed enough polls to close because, of course, you got your time zones rolling across the country, right? That you could get a sense of where the election was going, right? So election day, let's talk about this. I believe that part of your privileges as a citizen is to vote. I believe part of your responsibilities as a citizen is to vote. It's not that hard. It has become incredibly easy to register to vote once you turn 18. I believe you should. As my daddy used to tell me, if you don't vote, you don't get to complain because it is your choice or your opportunity to make your voice heard. And it's important. Got to remember, elections are not just federal elections, right? Everybody's like, oh, it's all about presidential politics and it's just such a pain in the butt. I don't want to deal with it, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but you also have local elections for local officials that, trust me, in a lot of ways can influence your life more than the president of the United States, right? Your local county commissioner, your local mayor, your local city council member, bond issues. You gotta get in there and you gotta do the work and you gotta vote. So this year, if you are 18, go register and go vote. That's all I got to say about that. All right, I hope you found this a little more enlightening. Like I said, the thing about AP government over AP history is you're going to get a whole lot more opining here because I think this is a very important topic. And like the other courses, AP government kind of shades things a bit. I think we need to put all the issues on the table as well as going over the material. So thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.